Hello and a good afternoon from New York, or a good morning if you're more to the west, or a good evening if you are joining us from Europe. Welcome to our monthly virtual panel, Window On, which today for the month of July will be on Window on racial inequalities in the labor market. Before I'm going to introduce this very important and interesting topic, I just want to make sure that those of you who have registered and are eligible for credits during this webcast can do so. You have to stay online for the entire webcast. Your credit is available for participation in the live webcast only. And then make sure that you type your full name and email address if you have HRCI or SHRM credits. And if you have CPE credits, also click the OK for the free pop-ups that occur during the program. So with that, let me first of all introduce the topic to you a little bit. Over the past 5 months in the Window On series, we have been, of course, talking about a wide range of issues related to COVID-19, including the economy and the reopening of the economy and innovation and fiscal policy. And our original intention for today was to talk about the labor market in COVID-19. And indeed, we will be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market. But then it has become increasingly clear from looking at COVID-19 that specific groups in society and in the labor market have been much more affected by the crisis than others. And then, of course, on top of that, in the last 2 months, America and the world have been once again confronted by the deep underlying racial and social injustices that have been sparked by the brutal death of George Floyd and the subsequent events. Many of those injustices are reflected in inequalities in the labor market, and COVID-19, in a way, has simply brought these challenges even more to the forefront in a very forceful manner. So we have basically decided to combine those two issues in one discussion. And for that, I'm going to rely very heavily on three experts today who I will introduce to you in a minute. The topics we're going to discuss today are sort of three focal points. We start with the COVID-19 crisis and how this has been impacting on wages and employment and wealth gaps between different groups, minorities, but also racial groups in society, but also some other minority groups. And in the second part of the webcast, we're going to focus more specifically on the more systemic underlying issues on the racial inequalities. These issues have been with us for a long time, and there is really a momentum now to really begin to tackle this in a much more systemic and systematic way. And we hope to really get deeper into that discussion. And then finally, of course, we're going to focus what can we do on the policy side, but also on the business side. Many of you attending this webcast are in the business community. What kind of policy and business initiatives can be undertaken to really bring a sustained improvement in trying to beginning to tackle these inequalities in a more systematic way going forward? So a lot of issues to be discussed, and as I mentioned, for that, I'm being joined by an excellent panel. First of all, I'm being joined by Elise Gould. Elise is the senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute. She's working there on wages, on poverty, on inequality, economic mobility, and healthcare. She's been writing in a couple of important books that the EPI has put out. And many of you will know Elise from her appearances on Bloomberg and on NPR. We see her regularly there as well on TV. And she has also been testifying in many policy circles, including the US House Committee on Ways and Means. Elise, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for
Great to
inviting
have you
me.
on. And then secondly, we have Ahu Yildirimaz. Ahu is the co-head of the ADP Research Institute. She's also vice president of corporate strategy at ADP. She directs the economic and labor market research at ADP. Of course, this company having a global employee sample of about 40 million workers worldwide gives her a huge data set and amount of data and insights that she can produce in order to get us better understand the labor market. And she's very well known also for her work in the flagship report of ADP, the National Employment Report, and the ADP Workforce Fertility Report. Again, thank you for joining us, Ahu. Great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
And then finally, as always, I'm going to rely on my colleague Gad Levanon. Gad is the head of our Labor Market Institute and vice president for labor markets, part of my team at the conference board. Gad has built an excellent amount portfolio of research and a great team of researchers on labor markets and is very visible with our community at the conference board and beyond. on labor market issues. So again, as always, Gad, I'm sure you're going to help us out today here to shed some light on the issues.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's go right away into the material. And those of you who are attending more regularly will know that we always start with a few poll questions. So here's a first poll question for the first section. A pretty straightforward question. As a result of COVID-19, I expect racial inequalities, which are things like access to jobs and wage level differences and job security, over the next 3 years to become much more pronounced, somewhat larger, about the same as already was the case, somewhat less or much less. So do you think that COVID-19 is sort of making these issues that we're going to talk about on inequalities in the labor market more pronounced, somewhat bigger, about the same, somewhat less, because maybe we're going to begin to gradually tackle it, or much less than was the case? Okay, we'll leave it open for a few more seconds, and then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to quickly respond to the results that you have provided us. Give it 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and now we'll be closing it. Thank you. So clear majority of you thinks that these issues will actually become more pronounced as a result of COVID-19. 42% of you say somewhat larger than it already was. As many as 25% of you saying it is much more pronounced. But some of you also think that maybe it's not really going to change that much, or perhaps even become somewhat less, because maybe we're going to tackle some of the problems, I guess. So Elise, let me start with you very quickly, your first reaction to these poll results.
Well, I think that's about how I would assess it. I think that some of the inequities we've been seeing this spring will persist through this coronavirus recession and into the recovery. It may take some time for the recovery to reach all people throughout the labor market. We know that Black and Hispanic or Latinx workers experience historically higher unemployment rates, and you're going to see those in many of the slides that we show you today. They've experienced historically higher unemployment rates and lower wages. We learned that in the recovery from the Great Recession, as well as in the late 1990s, it takes very low unemployment rates for the benefits of those tight labor markets to translate into better outcomes for these historically marginalized groups. So it could take some time before we really see those improvements.
Ahu, your first response.
Actually, the results are very much understandable. One of the things that we experience in this downturn, the magnitude and the speed were very much different compared to the other recessions. So I think that definitely will play a role as we get into the recovery process, and we'll have to see how the economy recovers to understand the full impact here.
Right. Good. Thank you. And Gad, finally, your first response to the poll.
So I think it will start with a much more pronounced increase in inequality, but I think in 3 years, I hope the pandemic will be behind us, and I expect a lot of the industries where there is a strong concentration of minorities, like food services and entertainment and personal care, to recover significantly, and I think at that point the negative impact of the pandemic on inequality will be mostly over. And I am optimistic that some of the wave of this topic coming to the top of the agenda will have some impact in 3 years, so we may see some progress in that regard.
Good. Well, that's a very good point, and we're going to come back to that later in the webcast. Towards the end of the webcast, I'm going to ask all of you actually, how much do we think will really change? And you already set the tone here a little bit, Gad. Thank you. Let me again say that please do ask questions or make comments. We have a lot of people on the call today. I cannot guarantee that we can deal with all your questions, but I'll try to do a job in terms of picking up at least some of them during the conversation. One question that came up right away, and that's where we're going to start, is whether we were going to provide some evidence and statistics about racial inequalities. And the answer to that is yes. That's why I picked this panel. And Ahu, let's start right away with you on this and really approach this a little bit indeed from the COVID-19 perspective. What do we know about the inequalities that we're looking at in the labor market right now?
Yeah, I mean, this downturn has unequal effects and different than the other recessions in many ways, right? we look at the wage and gender and age, different cohorts, different groups, and how they reacted just post-COVID. So we looked at from our data March till mid-April. So let's say first 6 weeks of the downturn. What we know that on average it's about 22% decline in the employment first 6 weeks. And then what you see here at the chart is looking at the employment compared to the mid-February, how much the employment declined for different income wage groups. So we have different bins, right? The bottom one is the wage group, which is about $15, I'll say $13 to $15 per hour. But you see very clearly from the chart that they actually, their employment decreased 35% during the first 6 weeks, like the deepest decline. Then you compare this to the top quantile, which is about the top quantile, I will say, around $30 to $32 average out. That's the group who makes around $30 to $32, and their actually employment decline around 9%. So this is not very surprising. In every recession, in downturn, yes, low-wage income groups are hurt. Most are hit mostly, but the magnitude, the gap, the inequality between these two wage groups are, I think, remarkable. Just to compare this, this is about, the first 6 weeks was about the 10 million low-wage workers. In Great Recession, we had a total of 8.5 to 9 million employment decline. So that would really give you how the low-wage income group, low-wage workers got hit so fast and much deeper. The next slide I have actually, again from our data, it's more around the gender side of it. You know, I'm very vocal when it comes to the pay equity, so I couldn't really do without this chart. So again, women got hit even more here, female workers. Now you look at the declines in the employment, there is a gap of 3 to 4%. So women employment declined 3 to 4% more than the male employment. So it is true. Sometimes I call this recession or this pandemic is a nickname inequality. We definitely have the evidence of that.
Yeah, let's dive a little bit deeper now and bring these issues of, gender to the race issue, but also the industries and occupations, because probably COVID-19 has impacted some industries and some occupations a lot more than others. So try to sort of deepen this point out a little bit further as Awe has set it up for us.
If you can go to the next slide, Bart, and I'll happy to do that. So what we did here, we divided all the employment in the U.S. to two groups, the ones that are more impacted by social distancing and the other. So about 1/4 of all jobs are grouped in the impacted occupations. And then we looked at those 8 groups for men and for women, Asian, Black, Hispanic, and White. And so what was before COVID?
Can you give some examples of the impacted occupations?
You know, the usual suspect, entertainment, travel, food services, personal care, those are the majority of the groups that we, or occupations that we included there.
That's a quarter of the total occupations you said. Yeah.
And so what we saw that in general women are much more concentrated in the impacted occupations, and within women, the women group, some of the minorities are especially concentrated there. I think the most extreme example are Hispanic women, where their share in the impacted occupation is about 12%, versus 6% in all other occupations. So, starting this, given the special nature of this COVID recession and the focus on the social distancing, this already puts a lot of the minority women in particular in a big disadvantage. I should note that among men that's not the case at all. They are kind of equally concentrated in both the impacted and the other occupations, but except for the white men, they are much more concentrated in the other occupations than impacted occupations.
And yet this is very different actually from the prior recessions, because prior recessions manufacturing is being hit, right? And we see the male employment really impacted.
Yeah.
So this is where this pandemic again, this recession really different from the others.
Yeah.
Just one more note. When we look at actually the gender impact, we control the industry. You still see women employment declining more. So we control the industry for wage and gender. So I didn't make it clear. So even you look at those concentrated industries, you balance it, you normalize it, you still see the low wage and the female workers being more impacted from an employment perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, to add to it, I do think that some of those frontline workers that's why you're seeing those differences in terms of lower wage workers being impacted as well. So even within those sectors that are female dominated, like leisure and hospitality or retail trade, women are disproportionately seeing those job losses. I just wanted to second that point. I think that's really important.
So, Elise, let's continue with you a little bit, because there are actually some interesting questions coming in. Now, okay, people going back to work, it's been a difficult process. We opened up the economy in May, and well, particularly in June, and we're now seeing some real challenges in going forward. But the major concern is that the inequality will not get resolved when people get back to work. Some groups that have been very hard hit may also have a harder time to come back to work. One question out there, for example, is about women again, who may have to stay home because kids are not going back to school. And what would be the impact on them? What is the impact on the salaries of different groups? And will their salaries be fully recovered or not? So can you talk a little bit about the going back to work?
Sure, I'm going to turn it to another slide here for you to see. I think that the concerns about school, absolutely. Women, mothers disproportionately are caregivers, primary caregivers of children, particularly then if you think about mothers in households where they are the sole or major breadwinner, they're going to have many challenges to be able to continue to put food on the table and put a roof over their head, while also the fact that their kids are going to be home and how are they supposed to work. Many do not have the option to telework. Many professionals, like those of us here, can telework successfully, but many people in lower wage categories are not able to telework, and so those are going to be particularly challenging. And we've talked about what those job losses look like. What we have in this figure here is looking at each month what has happened with the unemployment rate for the six different groups that I've laid out here. You can see the spike for almost all of them that happened in April. The overall unemployment rate hit 14.7%, has since come down to 11.1% in June. But it's important to remember, even at 11.1%, the unemployment rate remains higher than the highest reached in the depths of the Great Recession. Right? It only hit 10.0% back in 2009. And you see here that the unemployment rate rose higher and more steeply for Black and Hispanic workers, and that more sharply, particularly for Latino workers, largely as we've already talked about because of occupational segregation, particularly in leisure and hospitality. Now we talk about the recovery. Unfortunately, we're seeing that the recovery has also disproportionately reached some group of workers more than others. White men and women, as well as Latino workers, saw significant improvements as some states began reopening their economies. Unfortunately, you're seeing here that Black workers didn't see those gains. In fact, the unemployment rate for Black men continued to climb. You see that in this graph. It continued to climb, hitting 16.5% in June. And in the latter part of June and early July, links that have posted since the data in these charts, right? We don't have the latest data yet. We're still in July. There were spikes in COVID cases in states where Latinx workers and their families disproportionately live. So if we look at places like California, Florida, Texas, are seeing cases rising in states that began to reshutter parts of their economy, this will likely slow the recovery in July for those workers.
That's interesting. So you think there's a geographical element to this data as well, that just some of the minorities are concentrated living in the areas that are currently hardest hit by new cases, like the South and West. Very interesting, very interesting. Gad, any other comments from your side on these results? And one question I had, and maybe you can respond to that, is again on the wage. When people come back, will they be hired at the same wage as which they lost their job? And again, would you see differences between different groups in the labor market?
Sure. So I will answer your question, but then I want to just go back to the chart and talk about the Asians for 1 second, because there's something interesting happening there. So whether they will come back. So, the two biggest determinants of wage growth are inflation and how tight the labor market is, and now both are, the unemployment rate is historically high and inflation is historically low, so you'd expect wages to deteriorate, wage growth to deteriorate. But one interesting thing is that at least in the coming months and currently, the unemployment rate is significantly overestimates the slack that exists in the labor market. And the reason is that a lot of people who are counted as unemployed are not actually looking for a job, or looking, but not with great interest in actually finding a job. And there are several reasons for that. A lot of people are still hoping to get back to their old job. They think that they are temporarily laid off, so they are not looking for another job. There's also the issue so far that unemployment benefits, that there are some estimates that 2/3 of all unemployed actually had a higher income after they became unemployed, and so maybe that in the margins impacts their how serious they are looking for a job. There's also issues of childcare that perhaps prevents a lot of people from seriously looking for a job if they don't have a good solution for their children, and the risk of getting COVID. I mean, in many of those jobs, there's a high risk of contagion. So in sum, it's probably the number of people who are seriously looking for work is much smaller than the number of people who are counted as unemployed. And that means that the labor market is not as loose as the unemployment rate suggests, and that may change in the next several months. But I think we are. It was a very long answer to your question about wages, but I think we will see a slowdown in wage growth, but perhaps not as much as we would expect, given such high unemployment.
I think that there may be some factors that are working on the other side. I might argue that the unemployment rate is actually understating weakness. I take your point, but I think that it may be understating weakness in the labor market because some people have left the labor market, not being counted, they're classified, and they're not being counted in the unemployment rate. So there may be some factors moving in both directions.
I wonder if instead of the unemployment rate, should we look at the employment versus population? So that's going to be maybe a better measure now, because there's so much discussions around the labor market participation, labor force participation, and the classification of unemployed. We did a survey, and God, you're so right. I mean, people have child care issues. People simply scared to go back to work, but also some people also give up. They just know that the bars in the area that I live, if I'm a bartender, I'm not going to find a job. So there is this cohort that I think is not counted for the unemployment rate in the labor participation, but they are simply just not looking for a job.
Yeah, and others,
I should
some of them, I'm not seeing it yet in the data. When I look at the employment population ratio, I agree. I think that's a great measure. It would definitely be my desert island measure if I only get to have one. And I think that when you look at the participation rates or the employment to population ratio for mothers with young children, you actually didn't see it fall as much as you might expect. A lot of the job losses were actually more among people without children at all, because a lot of the job losses were among younger people who didn't have children. So you don't see that yet in the data. I think as the schools continue to close, you may see that they're less able to come back to the labor force, but they didn't have as large of a drop-off.
You are so right, because that surprised me. We looked at that in our data, and I had this whole theory that I was right, and you're so right. We even seen that also in the data. That's a puzzle, a little bit.
I agree.
Yeah, you're already moving a little bit into the next section. Gerd, do you want to make a last comment on this section, and then we move on and deepen this a little further?
So, okay, so two, if you don't mind, two comments. So one, we had the conference board, we have the consumer confidence survey, and one of the questions we asked there is how easy or difficult it is to find a job. And this measure is historically been extremely correlated with the unemployment rate. So we'd expected that now that the unemployment rate is historically high, we would see people saying that it's very difficult to find a job, but that was not the case. I mean, it's more difficult than it was in February, but it's not historically different. And this disconnect between this measure and the unemployment rate has been the largest, by far the largest we've ever seen. Now, one, I promised that I had a comment about
my
the
2
Asian.
cents on that, because we see that from the data. The labor market is tight for high-skilled workers. Still is tight. You see the switching behavior for high-paid, skilled kind of jobs, professional services, finance jobs, a lot of offers happening, a lot of movement. The question is, how tight, or is it tight, or can we even use the word tight for low-skilled job market? So I think there's really polarization in the job market today that we need to be careful, because some parts of the labor market is functioning really well, but whereas we see some occupations completely out from the occupation list. So that's how I would chime in.
No, I agree. I agree. It's very different. Highly educated white-collar people now versus people in jobs that require less education, and the ones that were significantly impacted. I just wanted to. Oh, sorry, you already went there.
No, I already
set me up well. So I just want to mention if you look at the Asian population here. The increase you see before the pandemic in February, that's the blue bars, the unemployment rate for Asian men and women was as high or even lower than it was for white people, and it jumped much higher than it did for the white population. I don't know exactly why that is, but it's a very noticeable, the jump was actually as high, if not higher, than for black and Hispanic workers. And I don't know if anyone in the panel has any thoughts on why Asians experience such a big increase in unemployment rate, but I thought it's under-discussed topic.
Is that not related to some of the occupations that many Asian female workers are in?
It's partly, I think, that, especially, I think, in a lot of personal care jobs, there is a high concentration of especially Asian women, but it's still, I don't think it explains as much, especially for Asian men.
Could it be?
Could
it be related to the regional factors, where more Asian population concentrated in some states?
Well, we did see a larger, that the large metro areas where I think a lot of Asians are concentrated in, they suffered more than the average, the rest of the U.S. So maybe that could be part of that, yeah.
So now we're going to really move on, and as mentioned, we already did talk about some of the sort of longer term trends. And just to sort of reiterate some of the charts here, indeed the unemployment rate, again, your last discussion about the increase in the Asian unemployment rate, in that case particularly for women, but overall you can see that the Asian unemployment rate was quite comparable to what it is
Yeah.
for whites. Whereas in the case of Latinos, and of course especially the African American population, you see that these rates have been much higher and that are very persistent. I think that's a very consistent story that we hear over and over again. And the other part that we did talk about that you did mention earlier, Ahu, is we need to look at the employment population ratio. And if you look at the employment population ratio, which really brings in the bigger picture, there is actually a little bit of an erroring there. It's still, of course, much more problematic for the African American population, but there has apparently been showing some narrowing here, which I'd like to make part of our discussion. But before we do that, I'm going to ask our team to give the second poll question here, because we really want to dive now a little bit more into the sort of more persistent reasons for the gap in labor market measures. So this is a little bit of a larger list, so I'll give you a little bit more time. Pick up to 3 of the most important reasons you think are the reason for these persistent long-term gaps. So we're moving beyond COVID here. This is the long-term gaps that we've been seeing originating between various racial groups in society. And you can pick up to 3. So we'll have more than 100%, but that's okay. We just want to see which ones you pick up. Take your time to read them. Also look lower in the list. Don't pick the top ones only. You can pick them, of course, but not only the top ones. And we'll give you a little more time to pick up 3. And then I'll ask each of our panelists to quickly respond 30 seconds, and we still have a lot to cover, so we're going to then quickly continue. 5 more seconds for all of you. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and now we're going to close it. Okay. Unequal access to college is 47%. Oh no, actually the most, I'm sorry, it was just closed and something changed. Unequal access to and lower quality of K through 12. 54% of you picked that one. Second is unequal access to college. So that's just a level higher in education. So it's really 2 of the educational factors that really pop up as the most important. And then the third one is lack of upward mobility on the job. That gets 38.3. As I said, it doesn't add up to 100 because you could pick up more than one. But it seems to me that those 3 are very important. The fourth one would be insufficient positive discrimination of minorities in hiring. Ahu, let me start with you. Which ones will you have picked? Do you think is this what you had expected?
Expected because top 3 really ties to the skills, right? And I think the core problem is there's a mismatch of the skill set with the supply of the labor and what we have so-called future of jobs, right? So I think this really reflects that we need to address the skill gap and really focus on how we're going to resolve the mismatch in our today's current labor market.
I have to respectfully disagree. I'm not surprised that that is the response here, but I would say, and we'll look at some slides in a couple minutes that show the data that education is really not the panacea to close these gaps, and a lot of the jobs of the future, if we look at the occupations of the next 10 years of growth, are not necessarily jobs that require a college degree. So we really need to shore up the wages and the working conditions of jobs across the economy and not depend on further education or further skills to close these gaps.
And you'll get us a little deeper into that in a second. Gad, your
well, my first response is that there are a lot of responses here that got a significant amount, and I think that's maybe the main message is that this is a very systematic problem that starts from the moment you're born and until late in your career. There are a lot of reasons across your life that that create those gaps, which is why it's so difficult also to solve this, because it's not one thing or two, it's across the board.
Yeah, no, and it's a fair comment that we always like to pick the top three ones, but it is fairly widely spread, and there are multiple reasons. So that's definitely a good point. At least let's dive a little bit deeper into this issue of skills and education, and your slightly different view on this. Let's move this poll away, and I think you have one or two slides that you also would like to share. So we're going to move you there right away, and you can get going.
Sure. Yeah, there's certainly some factors have a larger role than others. You notice on that poll that higher incarceration rates, that's definitely criminal justice reform can have a huge impact on people's labor market outcomes as well. I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to speak too much to that. But here in this slide, I'm showing you that black-white gap, those wage gaps. Now we're talking about wages and not employment to population ratio or unemployment rates. These are wage gaps. Black-white wage gaps are wide no matter how you measure it. So on average, black workers are paid 73 cents on the white dollar. Black-white wage gaps persist where you look at for men and for women across the wage distribution. The black-white wage gap is smallest at the bottom of the wage distribution at the 10th percentile, where wage floor, as you know, the minimum wage, keeps the lowest wage black workers from being paid even lower wages. The largest black-white wage gaps are found at the top of the wage distribution, and that's explained in part by occupational segregation. The underrepresentation of black workers in the highest wage professions and the overrepresentation in lower wage professions. And the pulling away of the top more generally. So by that I mean just growing inequality. People at the top have seen a lot faster gains in their wages, incomes, wealth over the last 40 years. Similarly, across various levels of education, a significant black-white wage gap remains. Black workers can't simply educate their way out of the gap. Even black workers with an advanced degree experience a significant wage gap compared to their white counterparts. So from that, I would say that it's clear that education is not a panacea for closing these wage gaps. And this shouldn't be shocking, as increased equality of educational access, as laudable a goal as that is, has been shown to have only small effects on class-based wage inequality. And racial wealth gaps have been almost entirely unmoved by a narrowing of the black-white college attainment gap. So it has some importance, but it has a very limited role. And on the next slide, I'll change it there. This shows that these trends have been getting worse over much of the last 4 decades. And this slide, I'm showing that worsening trend since 2000. So this looks at the black-white wage gaps. That's what's shown in those percents, the wage penalty that black workers face. And in 2000, in 2007, and in 2019, and you can see that that has grown for each of those groups, for high school, for college, for advanced degree. Even the bottom one is the regression adjusting for different factors. That has increased as well over the last 20 years. And it's important to remember the historical and social context for those differences in black and white labor market experiences and labor market outcomes. Workers' ability to claim higher wages is not just what they're showing, what you see, but it's a host of social, political, and institutional factors outside of the individual's control. And that systematic social deprivation and economic disadvantage is maintained and reinforced by those with economic and political power. And I've talked about how occupational segregation plays a role. That's particularly important for black women, and black women who face a double wage penalty for their race and gender. And these trends in black-white wage gaps found here are supported by other research, and I think other slides that are going to show that those black-white wage gaps expanded with rising inequality over the last 40 or so years.
Yeah, that's a lot on the table here. Do you want to respond to this and get your light on this hypothesis?
Yeah, funny that you asked, because I have this slide that talk exactly about that. So what I show here is 2 lines. One is the gap between in percent difference between wages of white non-Hispanic and black workers, and the other between white non-Hispanic and Hispanic workers. Both are for full-time workers. And you see that those gaps are large. It's around 15+% at the moment, but perhaps more interesting is that for the white-black gap is increasing, whereas the white-Hispanic gap is declining. And another thing is what we kind of try to decompose and account for the gaps, how much of it is because of differences in education, how much of it is because of occupational segregation, how much of it is unaccounted by any factor. And one of the interesting things is once you start accounting for it, and also geography and other variables, the Hispanic gap doesn't disappear, but it significantly declines to about 3 or 4%, is remained unexplained, whereas for the white-black gap, it's still close to 10% remains unexplained even after we account for everything we can measure, and that unexplainable gap for in the white-black gap is continuing to grow, whereas it's not growing for Hispanic population in recent years. So it still leaves a lot of questions for why we see all of that, but I think it's the comparison between the Hispanic and black relative labor market situation is very important to note.
So one reason that has come up for this unexplainable gap are these so kind of unobservable factors that you do not know directly from the labor market statistics. One of them being this issue of underemployment, where we see particular in black college graduates, so black workers who have had a high level of education, to still end up in jobs for which there's really no degree required. So they're ending up they're underemployed in a way, given their capacity and their capabilities. Do you think that gap, and maybe Elise, because this is an EPI chart with credit to EPI, I'd like to have all of you comment on some of this and other unobservable factors in these?
Yeah, well, so yeah, there is in the jargon, it's called occupational segregation of that. In the case of the black population, even given a level of education, they end up in jobs, in occupations that pay less. And this chart also shows that well. And I think this hasn't changed much. I think that has probably something to do, or something that could be impacted by recruitment at the recruitment level in companies, but it could also be related to things, and I haven't studied that yet, but I have a hypothesis that it could also be related to what people are majoring in. So there could be a difference between what white people are majoring in college versus what black people are majoring in, which could be a whole completely different set of policies that could change that.
Yeah. Elisa, you want to speak to this chart?
I would be very surprised if the majors can close that, almost a 9 percentage point gap between these two numbers. I think that what we're also seeing is that many black workers, many black college graduates, even graduates of graduate school have to get another degree to be able to be seen on an even playing field as some of their white counterparts, and they're simply not given the benefit of the doubt in terms of having less experience and being able to get that job. They're not seen as with the same amount of potential that maybe other workers may be seen. And so there is a certain amount of discrimination in the labor market that is very clear, that is left over even after you control for many other factors.
Oh, you've heard this discussion over the past few minutes. Let's wrap this section up with you on some of these systemic causes.
I think because there are systematic problems, I completely agree with my colleagues. But I think I don't want to undermine the access to the job market. And whether we call it college graduation or apprenticeship training, we still has to be in the job market to overcome the systematic inequalities. So I think from the fundamental perspective, we should provide the equal access to every cohort in the labor market. This could be race, this could be age. Age is also another, problem. We have to equalize that. And then, yes, like gender issues, right? We have, and the race issues, those systematic issues we can overcome and make the numbers really move up after that. So I just want to separate those two factors.
Yeah, no, the access issue is a really important issue as part of this discussion. We need to move on, but I want to pick up two quick questions that I think are interesting to address, and whoever of you wants to take it. One question is about retirement, and basically what will be the labor market impact from those that are now opting out due to buyouts or early retirement and related intellectual loss that will come with the exit of that segment. So maybe one of you want to pick that one up. To what extent is there an effect of that? The second one is on the gig economy, which I think is interesting also from the perspective of different ethnic groups in society, because some of them may be more represented in some of these occupations in the gig economy. So who wants to take up any of those two questions?
Throw this and then Lisa and Gad, I'm sure they would dive in. We did actually study on the gig economy, gig workforce, but we looked at more white-collar environment. So because we capture the giggers in the enterprise world. So I'm not talking about the Uber drivers. I'm not talking about the I don't use a lot, so Lyft, etc. What was very interesting before the pandemic, the 60 plus, we have seen a lot of retirees came back to the big companies as a gig worker, as 1099M. But what was, I think, really amazing to see that these were all high-skilled, high-income retirees. So a lot of white-collar workers, they actually did not have a problem to find a job. And I believe they still continue to, we didn't run our numbers post-pandemic, but I don't think those sectors are impacted. I think, again, when we talk about the gig, we have to be very clear, and also age. Some cohorts, some certain bins of the age distribution still doing well, and that's why I'm going to go back and tie back to the high wage, low wage jobs, or high skill versus low skill jobs.
Yeah, good, yes. Elise or Gad, any other comments on any of these two questions? We're good. We move on. We have a lot to cover, so let's do that because we need to. The time flies, and there's a lot to be discussed. So let's go to the last poll question and the last section, which is really on what to do about this. I mean, we sort of now did a lot on the diagnosis, but what are, again, sort of 3 of your most important initiatives that policymakers or business leaders can undertake to tackle racial inequalities in the workplace? And again, there's a lot of answers here, so take your time. Don't only pick the top 3, or even though they're important. Which top ones of the 3 would you pick? And you can pick up to 3 and take a little bit of time to read them through. And then again, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to spend a few minutes on reflecting on this poll and giving your overall view, leaving a few minutes for the last question as well. So give you a little bit more time to pick 1, 2, or 3 of those answers of things that you believe are the most important initiatives that policymakers or business leaders could undertake to tackle racial inequalities in the workplace. And we give it now 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then we're going to stop. So interesting results here. 64% of you have picked investment into internships and trainee positions for minorities. So really make sure that we create these places. This is a little bit related to your access to the labor market point, I believe. And again, we should remind ourselves that a lot of our audience are business executives. So it's perhaps no surprise that many of them pick this. The second important one is to address the skill gaps through career pathway opportunities. Those really, I think, are 2 standing out. The others are mentioned as well. 39% says high equality in K through 12, in underprivileged areas is a very important one. Gerrit, let me start this time with you, picking up on some of those and making some comments on where you believe policy or business action will really make a difference.
I think I would agree with the number one choice here. I think that would be on my list as well. I think targeting the solution to where the problem is and that's exactly the kind of solution that deals with the problem. I think you know, a lot of it is also, you know, I'm an immigrant. I came here as an adult, so I don't have a lot of the kind of background but I always noticed how the topic of racial discrimination and racial relations is such a sore and sensitive topic for Americans, and I think that part of the problem is that almost no one dares to talk about those issues, and within companies it's you're more likely to get in trouble than to accomplish anything positive. So I think more education and discussion, and especially using data. I have many times in my career seen how data changes people's opinions, and I think kind of trying to deal very deeply with the, I think, deep and very widespread prejudices is an essential. Without it, if those prejudices remains, it would be very difficult to change the country as a whole.
It's interesting, these results. I think investments in internships, trainee positions, you know, particularly targeting certain groups are great ideas. I think that we want to make sure that those are paid and paid well, especially for people coming out of college. They have a lot of debt. They don't have the luxury of having low-paid internships because they have to start paying off their debt. So making sure that those are a real gateway into better jobs. Some of these other ones I'm going to comment on. We saw earlier that the minimum wage keeps some of the lowest wage black workers from even lower wages, and the need for a federal minimum wage is absolutely dire. That would disproportionately benefit black workers because they're overrepresented among low wage workers and also are less likely to live in states or localities that have passed a higher minimum wage. So they are left behind there. Also, we want to make it easier for workers to form unions. That has been shown time and time again in research to narrow the black-white wage gap. Black workers are more likely to be in a union than white and get a bigger boost from being in a union than white. Therefore, unions can help shrink that black-white wage gap. Related research has shown that the decline in unionization, the flip side of this, has led to an expansion of the black-white wage gap. I saw some questions about why that's expanding. That would be one of the reasons. I also think it's really important to use all of our fiscal and monetary policy levers to achieve and maintain high-pressure labor markets like we saw in the late 90s, like we saw in the last couple of years. That can strengthen wage growth and can strengthen outcomes for black and Hispanic workers. That's where I'll stop.
Yeah, good stuff. Ahu, what are the ones that you would
I would pick the top one again. I'll get back to the skill set building, and this is, I think, the corporations have some responsibility here as well with the government, with academia. We really need a collaboration. Not to prepare the, not even to prepare for the future, to just fix the current labor market inequalities, and this is perhaps through a apprenticeship approach, like we know it in Germany. Manufacturing is a great example of this. We know that pre-pandemic, the rate of openings were increasing faster than the rate of fillings from the BLS data. We knew that, and I doubt that all those openings are really high degree required jobs. By the way, when I say skill, I'm also talking about haircutters. There was a shortage of haircutters in the United States. Like there was a shortage of truck drivers, actually, which I hear from our clients, right? So it's not, the skills does not necessarily mean that you require a PhD degree, a master's degree, or even college degree. So it's just, it could be any skill, but we need to put the system really in place so that perhaps corporations can act on this, train the different cohorts in the labor market. Because one of the things we also know from the third-party research is that the corporate spending on training actually has been declining. I mean, I started, 30 years ago in a very big, large corporations in the United States. I mean, of course, I went with a graduate degree, but a lot of things I learned at work. So this apprenticeship model, I think, will may help to address some of the inequalities, as long as we put the wage equality into the system. So it has to go together.
Okay, so I want to get to a final question. We're obviously identifying things that we can do to improve, but as we all I think agree, this is a systemic issue. It's been around for many, many decades, as many of us have said on this conversation. It's probably not going to go away overnight, and one or two policy measures are not going to make a difference. So the question I'm going to ask you, and this is sort of our wrap-up question because we're only 3 minutes left, is basically, if we really want things to be different in 15 years' time from now, what is the one big thing that you think should have to change in order not to be in the same situation as we were 15 years ago compared to where we are today? And I will let me start with you there. What's the kind of big thing that you would think will make a difference 15 years from now?
I think we have to, we have to really resolve the wage inequality for the same job. So pay equity is very much important. And I'm not talking about the gender pay equity only here. In general, as Liz mentioned, for the same job, same pay. And that's the key. If we start with there, then at least we have a jump start on the whole big policy issue.
So I think there are a lot of things that policymakers can do, but given this audience, I think there's a lot of things that private employers can do, taking the initiatives on making equity a priority. And there's 3 things. I'd say 1, conduct an equity audit that examines the diversity of your workplaces, not only in numbers, but also in positions, promotions, pay, and workplace culture. Then taking action based on what you find. 2, diversify the networks and outreach you're using for hiring, ensuring that the pool of job candidates is diverse. It's important to realize that it's too late to broaden your network when it's time to post for a job. You need to broaden your networks and not rely on what you've always done. And 3, I would advise you to refrain from asking new hires about pay history. Recent research has shown that this will perpetuate disparities. So I think taking those 3 steps are things that you can enact right now, doesn't require policymakers, and that action will make improvements.
Great suggestions.
I know I'm an economist and I usually talk with data, but here I think it's changing minds, and in a 15-year period, a lot of things. I just watched the other day the documentary about Judge Ginsburg, and to see like what were the opinions about the place of the woman 50 years ago versus where it is now. I think it's been a big change, and I think it creates actual changes in the labor market when kind of fundamental opinions about differences between people change. So I think we need to continue, and I think there has been an improvement in recent decades also about race relations and opinions on different races. So I think we need to accelerate that and deal with that before a real change could happen.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. I wish I could put in mind, it would be positive discrimination, by the way. I know it's controversial, but I can't talk about it, so maybe I'll get invited for another webcast to talk about that. But anyway, thank you, Elise and Ahu and Gad. This was a really good discussion. I didn't have a hard time to ask you to respond to each other. You did. This is a very, very important topic. The Conference Board will not let us go. Please go to our website where we actually have dedicated content and activities around the issue of racial and social injustice in society. So this is a topic we want to be on. This may very well come back in our next window on programs. We're going to take 1 month of vacation, which is end of August. We'll be back on September 23rd. And as this is always sort of real-time topics, I'm not quite sure yet what the topic will be, but please stay tuned. And if you have registered, you will, of course, automatically receive your emails. Please join us for some upcoming programs, some of it related actually to what we've been talking about, including preparing for the post-pandemic labor market and creating space for race-based discussions at the executive level. So really some important programs that show that we're committed to this topic at the conference board. Thank you again for joining us, and we wish you a good summer. Hope that you can enjoy some of it despite the constraints that you are facing. We wish you all well and hope to see you again back in September. And again, thank you for the panel and have a great day.